With the exception of total victory, nothing in World War II was so eagerly awaited by the peoples of the Allied countries as the invasion of Fortress Europe. Hitler has built the defenses for 4 years, an impregnable wall of concrete, steel, and men. And to crush it and what lies beyond, the Allies mount an army of nearly 3 million men and the greatest sea and air armada the world has ever known. After its conquest by the Nazis, France becomes one of the most heavily fortified areas in history. But early in the war, plans are made to launch an invasion of this fortress from across the English Channel. At Casablanca, in January of 1943, the Allies commit themselves to the liberation of Europe, while their soldiers, sailors, and airmen storm the gates of Tripoli. North Africa is yet to be won, but the combined chiefs of staff speak of their distant dream to cross the Channel, return to the continent. The chiefs of state christened the supreme operation with a noble code name, Overlord. At Tehran in November 1943, the most important political meeting since the Versailles Treaty brings together Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill for the first time since the start of World War II. Their prime objective is to set a date for the invasion of Nazi-held Western Europe. There is, however, a clash of opinions on strategy. Stalin demands an invasion through France to relieve pressure on the Russian front. Churchill argues instead for strengthening and extending the present campaign in the Mediterranean. Roosevelt settles the debate by voting for the invasion through France. The first week of May 1944 is set as the target date. The cross-channel invasion was to coincide with the beginning of a new Russian offensive on the Eastern Front. A week later in Tunis, North Africa, Roosevelt designates General Dwight D. Eisenhower Supreme Commander of the new Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower's orders are simple and direct. He will enter the continent of Europe and undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. Eisenhower, or Ike as he liked to be called, had already successfully led the invasions of North Africa and Sicily. Now the Allied forces were counting on him to do it again. At stake this time was the outcome of the entire war.
The stage is being set for the beginning of the great and crucial test all over the world. I have complete confidence that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and all the civil populations of the United Nations will demonstrate once and for all that an aroused democracy is the most formidable fighting machine that can be devised.
General Eisenhower had under his command the top military men in both Great Britain and the United States to assist in working out the enormously complex plans for the long-awaited invasion. The directive from the combined chiefs of staff was simple: destroy Hitler's empire, smash it by air, break it wide open, and then invade by sea. The cross-channel assault was the crux of the plan. Early capture of a large port was of the utmost importance. Along the channel where the sea meets France stood Hitler's west wall of concrete, stone, and steel to mock the frail hopes of the Allies.
German strategy in Western Europe will come to be dependent upon a series of fortifications along the coast, which will be known as the Atlantic Wall. The Germans will design divisions called static divisions to man these coastal fortifications and will attempt to put them along the most likely avenues of Allied invasion. The Allies will choose Normandy as their invasion site partly because the fortifications in Normandy are weaker than they are at other points along the coast.
For 4 years, Hitler's Atlantic Wall has been his obsession. Thousands of laborers have worked to forge its guns, pillboxes, and concrete obstacles into an impregnable barricade. The Nazis know that an Allied invasion is imminent, but they cannot tell when it will come or where. They think the attack most likely will strike where the distance across the channel is narrowest, at Calais. Consequently, their strongest forces and fortifications are concentrated there. The wall would be even stronger if Germany's commander-in-chief in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, believed in it as much as Hitler. With 2,000 miles of coastline to defend, von Rundstedt believes with Frederick the Great that he who defends all defends nothing. Assuming the initial landing will be successful, von Rundstedt plans to move his powerful reserve force up immediately and drive the invasion army back into the sea. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler summons Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, legendary Desert Fox, to prepare German defenses against the expected Allied invasion. Rommel will be the field commander for von Rundstedt. However, on the day of the invasion, Hitler, having lost confidence in his generals, will direct the strategy against the Allies himself. Rommel's first mission for Hitler is to inspect the Atlantic Wall, a highly publicized line of defense fortifications along the coast of Europe. He's appalled by what he sees. The defenses are shockingly inadequate and in many places non-existent. He calls the wall a gigantic fake, a paper hoop for the Allies to jump through. Rommel warns that if the Allies are not stopped at the water's edge during the first 24 hours of battle, the war will be lost. Concluding that the success of the defense depends on air cover that the dwindling Luftwaffe can no longer provide, Rommel convinces Hitler that the Atlantic Wall must be reinforced in a furious race against time, so certain was he that the Allies would strike sometime that summer. The invasion might come at any point on the 3,000 miles of coastline from Norway to Spain, but the most likely invasion points are in France, one in Normandy, close to Cherbourg, and the other at Calais, only 20 miles from England. Engineering battalions, combat troops, and slave laborers are pressed into service, 500,000 men in all, to build an impregnable Atlantic wall that will stop the enemy at the water's edge. Believing that the invasion force must be destroyed before it ever gets across the beaches, the energetic Desert Fox orders every gap in the wall closed. The high water line, he says, must be the main fighting line. Rommel sets about turning the beach approaches into a nightmare of submerged obstacles, concrete dragons' teeth, hedgehogs, mines, and spikes. On the beaches themselves, the artillery is roofed and walled with concrete, laced together with miles of barbed wire. Thousands of new tank traps, obstacles, and pillboxes are added to the wall. By the end of May, 4 million mines are buried in the Normandy sand. The German heavy coastal guns and fortifications are heavily camouflaged in an effort to fool any Allied reconnaissance from the sea or air. The Atlantic Wall seemed solid enough to withstand any Allied assault. Rommel's men trusted him when he said that any invasion would be another Dieppe.
Auf unsere starken Anlagen, im Hinblick auf den vorzügigen Geist unserer Truppe, auf die neue Bewaffnung und die Kampfmittel, die uns in die Hand gegeben sind, können wir den kommenden Ereignissen mit größter Ruhe entgegensehen, brauchen uns keine Sekunde den Kopf zu brechen, ob es gut oder schlecht geht. Es geht bestimmt gut und ich glaube nicht, dass England ein zweites Mal wiederkommt, wenn hier den Versuch macht.
Designed as a probing action for an eventual second front, Dieppe had been a tactical disaster. Elements of the Canadian 2nd Division were sent in without the benefit of a softening up bombardment and were landed directly against heavily fortified German positions. When the survivors withdrew, they left behind 70% of their number. The planners of Operation Neptune, the amphibious component of Overlord, mined valuable experience from Dieppe. Lord Louis Mountbatten later wrote, "For every soldier who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day." As preparations forged ahead on both sides of the Channel, Hitler, in a flash of intuition, decided to move a number of strong units into the Normandy area, despite his feeling that Calais would be the invasion point. As a result, in the months just before the landing, the defenses were stiffened considerably. One division ordered back from Hungary is the Panzer Lehr. Drawn from Panzer School demonstration troops, Panzer Lehr was superior to any German division in the West. The 243rd Infantry Division and a number of separate units, some at full strength and full equipment, were also ordered to Normandy. While Allied intelligence expected to land against 3 coastal divisions, in actuality, there had been a significant upgrading of troops in the area. On shore, the Nazis thought they were invincible. However, at sea, they couldn't compete with Allied naval power. To discourage the advance of Allied warships and transports, the Germans planted the waters off the French coast with a profusion of mines. The Allied plan was to breach the wall and smash the German spine. But where? The coast was searched between Holland and Spain, and intelligence gathering became the top priority. Agents were dropped over France to divine German positions and troop strength. One-man submarines, torpedo boats, commandos, all were used to bring back cupfuls of sand from the beaches for analysis. It would have to support 30-ton tanks and heavy wheel traffic. Aerial reconnaissance was utilized also. A special study of the weather along the Normandy coast was done, and German radio communications were monitored constantly for fresh intelligence on their forces. All this was just a part of the pre-invasion work done by Allied intelligence agencies. Beach exits and tidal range eliminated shallow flushing. The sand and the wind canceled the Belgium coast. The North Seine beaches were too small and cliffs barred the approaches. The Pas de Calais was heavily defended. All factors eventually pointed toward Normandy. Allied gliders and planes could land on the fields inland. The beaches could support tanks and other heavy equipment, and access was not restricted by land features.
The geography of England and the location of the deep-water ports is really going to play a part in both the bodyguard deception and the actual Allied planning. The location of these ports, which are going to be concentrated in the southern part of England, really dictate the location of the invasion to a certain extent. There are no real deep-water ports across from the Pas de Calais area, which really makes it difficult for the Allies to stage a successful cross-channel invasion, even though it's the shortest distance. With the ports in the south, the Normandy becomes a much more logical choice.
The general plan approved as the outline of the operation the Allies intended to conduct was land on the Normandy coast, build up the resources needed for a decisive battle in the Normandy-Brittany region, and break out of the enemy's encircling positions. Pursue on a broad front with 2 army groups emphasizing the left to gain necessary ports, reach the border of Germany, and threaten the Ruhr. On the right, a link-up would be made with forces that were to invade France from the south. Complete the destruction of enemy forces west of the Rhine, while constantly seeking bridgeheads across the river. Overlord planners knew the invasion was most vulnerable in its early stages. For the Allies to get ashore and stay there on D-Day and beyond, it was imperative that the German Wehrmacht, scattered throughout Europe, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, and the Balkans, be influenced to maintain their positions. If the Germans were able to quickly reinforce their positions in Normandy, their overwhelming firepower and numerical superiority might drive the invaders back into the sea. Toward reaching the objective of keeping German forces scattered, an incredibly intricate and devious deception scheme to hoodwink the Germans on the date and location of the cross-channel invasion was concocted. Codenamed Bodyguard, the plan included 5 erroneous strategic scenarios. The Allies were convinced continued strategic bombing would force Germany into surrender. Invasion could be postponed indefinitely. The Allies would attack German-held Norway in May or June of '44. A series of major Allied operations would be launched against the Balkans in May or June of '44. The Soviets would launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front in July of '44, 2 months after the actual date. Allied commanders were convinced that the earliest possible invasion date was mid-July 1944. Bodyguard strove to create a thin edge for the Allies that might mean the difference between triumph and defeat. But for the plan to work, all elements of Bodyguard had to seem plausible to the Germans. With the Bodyguard plan of deception, the Allies were attempting to pull off the greatest hoax in history.
Intelligence is absolutely critical to the Allies in this plan. And they can send all the false traffic they want to. They can set up all these different ways of deceiving the Germans. But if they can't judge how successful they're being, it's really pretty useless. The stage is set for the success of Bodyguard when the British break the Enigma code early in the war. And in this way, they're able to use intercepted German radio communications to know that they are in fact being successful with the Bodyguard deception plan.
All through the spring of 1944, at the Supreme Headquarters in London, plans proceeded for Operation Overlord. Assisting Eisenhower were his 3 top invasion commanders. British Chief Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory would command the Air Forces. Admiral Bertram Ramsay of the Royal Navy was the naval chief, and British General Bernard Montgomery commanded the ground forces. Each man was a mature professional with a lifetime of military experience. All had diligently studied warfare. Yet as a team, they failed to act in complete harmony. To some extent, this problem stemmed from differences in British and American doctrine and training. Mutual trust and confidence were often absent. In private, they resented and belittled one another, with the Americans harboring feelings bordering on contempt for Montgomery. In spite of their differences, they scrupulously observed the chain of command, which descended from Eisenhower. Overlord planners adopted first a master plan and then had to coordinate every last detail of the ground, sea, and air plans. The original invasion plan, which called for an attack along a 3-division front, was expanded into one along a 5-division front. This made the acquisition of more landing craft essential. For these reasons, D-Day was postponed from early May until early June. The air plan sought to gain several objectives. First, by progressively wearing down the Luftwaffe, the Allies would gain control of the skies. Second, the destruction of critical points in rail and highway systems would isolate coastal areas selected for assault and disrupt communications. Long months before D-Day, assault from the sky began. This was the key that would unlock the gate to Fortress Europe. Day and night, the Allied air forces send their bomb cargoes into the vitals of Hitler's self-proclaimed kingdom. Factories, aerodromes, synthetic fuel plants, crude oil refineries, munitions works, railroads, canals, power plants, anything that is part of the war effort becomes a target.
The Allies have divergent views on how to conduct strategic bombing. The British will opt to go with night bombing to reduce the losses in air crews and give them more success in returning aircraft to the base. The Americans will see night bombing as too iffy. They'll want more accurate bombing, and it has to do with the American way of waging war. This divergent view of the Allies will really be very successful for them because, in effect, you'll have bombers over Germany 24 hours a day.
The climax of the air war came in February of 1944 when the Luftwaffe made a desperate effort to sweep our day bombers from the sky. The battle raged for a week. The cost to us was high, but the German Air Force came out of the battle crippled beyond redemption, a ghost of its former power. By D-Day, the German Luftwaffe had been reduced to fewer than 900 planes and was incapable of giving any concentrated air support. Allied superiority of the skies above France had been won. With the Luftwaffe swept from the skies, the tempo of air attacks steadily increased. The heavy air blows against the railroads in France began in April, about 2 months before the tentative invasion date. In order to isolate the battle area in Normandy and hinder the enemy's efforts to bring up men and supplies, it becomes clear that additional time would give the Air Force a better opportunity to accomplish this critical objective. For every bomb dropped on Normandy, 2 were dropped on the Pas-de-Calais to reinforce Fortitude South. During the 2 months campaign, the Allies lost more than 1,600 bombers. While such losses represented less than a 1% attrition rate for the 144,800 bomber missions flown, the various Allied air forces lost nearly 12,000 men in the course of their pre-Overlord operations. Many months before the amphibious assault on Normandy was set to take place, thousands of American soldiers were assigned to Great Britain to participate in the training and buildup of forces to be used in the invasion. For many, the transfer was far from direct. Some would study invasion on the beaches of North Africa and Sicily and Italy before they ever set foot on French soil. But throughout the winter and spring of 1944, great convoys churned across the Atlantic to British ports. Early in the war, German U-boats had reaped a grim harvest on shipping bound for England. However, as 1943 drew to a close, the balance had shifted. The Allies countered the U-boat menace by employing the convoy system, which concentrated merchant shipping into a group that was more easily defended. Coupled with extensive air patrols and killer groups organized around escort carriers, losses to the merchant fleet dropped dramatically. Even so, the North Atlantic crossing was still extremely dangerous.
Actually crossed in one of the largest, I was told, one of the largest convoys ever to go across the Atlantic. I think there was something like 160 ships. And it took 17 days to go across, which is about, I guess, 3 times as long as it usually takes. A submarine got in the convoy and did destroy several ships. And I happened to see one, which was a very, very unpleasant sight to see because it happened to be a tanker and exploded, and you know that there were probably no survivors.
As the convoys slowly plied the waters of the North Atlantic, their hulls were virtually bursting with the tools of war. If there was one factor that gave the Allies an edge in the coming battle, it was America's ability to produce staggering amounts of war material in incredibly short order. In addition to the tens of thousands of men America would provide, most of the equipment that would be employed on D-Day had come from the forges of American industry.
The when and where of arrival is not for publication, but the why is common knowledge. Another great influx of American units for the invasion of Europe. When the balloon goes up, these fully trained men will participate in the greatest military expedition in history.
Each month, the United States pours 150,000 of her young men onto the British Isles.
The people were very nice, I say, extremely nice. The countryside is all green, very wet, very damp. The summertime, I think, consisted of approximately a week of good weather spread out. Maybe it was a bad year.
All England becomes an armed camp, one vast depot of armament and supplies. A massive concentration of men and machines becomes the subject of a joke in British pubs. England, they say, would sink into the sea if it weren't for the barrage balloons holding her up.
There was a lot of materiel, tanks, trucks, all kinds of boxes, ammunition and so on the roads, ready to be loaded onto the various ships that were going to take part in the invasion. We all knew that we were going to be part of the operation and not knowing exactly what.
In the early months of 1944, nearly 1 million Allied soldiers arrived in the United Kingdom, swelling the potential striking force of Allied fighting men there to almost 3 million. The strength of the Allied air forces in the British Isles had grown from a few thousand planes in early 1942 to more than 15,000 planes of all types. The 5,000 Allied bombers in England were prepared to drop hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs in support of the invasion. The stockpile of vehicles alone for use in the invasion totaled hundreds of thousands of tons. Every available foot of space on overcrowded Britain was used for storage. Supplying the invasion over the beaches was a unique challenge, so the Allies undertook a project as unique as the problem. The famous mulberries, a plan to construct artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. This mulberry unit was practically a complete harbor.
The mulberries are an incredible invention. It's a series of concrete piers and support facilities that are floated across the channel and sunk in the shallower water off the coast. What you're doing is creating a deep water port on a beach.
All over the British Isles, experiments were being conducted with devices only recently developed for combating the German war machine. The British set about the task of designing equipment that would facilitate destruction of German obstacles. An area in a secluded spot in eastern England is used for actual tests of the equipment that has been developed. Heavy rollers for destroying mines were among the many items constantly under test. Senior commanders used every possible moment in visiting and inspecting troops. These visits, sandwiched between a seemingly endless series of conferences and staff meetings, were necessary and highly valuable for the morale of the troops. The men who were to make the greatest assault in history trained exhaustively under conditions similar to those they would probably meet on the continent. The pre-invasion exercises were much tougher than the maneuvers they'd known in the U.S., and the men took them much more seriously. The troops gained needed experience in coordinating their simulated attack with that of other units and operating as a well-integrated fighting force. Weapons like the bazooka, used for the first time in World War II, were being tested, and the men themselves were toughened up for the invasion with exercises and extensive sessions of hand-to-hand fighting. Assault training included every phase of the coming battle. Joint maneuvers of the ground, sea, and air forces which were to make the attack were held along the southern coast of England.
We had one night jump in England. It was very dark. You couldn't see anything. I think we got spread out all over England. I don't know what we were doing there, but we had training all over England in the field.
Every duty was performed as if this were the real thing. British shores, chosen for their similarity to the coastlines of the Normandy Peninsula, were the training areas for these maneuvers. The American, British, and Canadian troops who train on England's landing beaches come to know well what it is they're getting ready for. The toughest training Allied troops have faced is thrown at every man. It's grinding, back-breaking, relentless, endless. As the Allies go into high gear for the invasion, the boys get pretty proficient. During training, every bit of gear was doubled, even though during the actual invasion they expected many would lose most of it. The soldiers knew the invasion would be tough, but the training was really intense. Some of the men were carrying as much as 150 pounds of equipment. Imagine running around with all that gear. but they had to. During breaks in training, many soldiers were able to get up to London on a 2-day pass. Wartime Britain was a place supercharged with activity. It was literally the crossroads of the world, filled with uniforms from all the nations united in the war against the Axis. There are no breathers across the English Channel. Rommel must utilize every diabolical mechanical device imaginable to block the invasion. And if the Allies get past the beaches, behind the guns and behind the obstacles are the battle-hardened soldiers and panzer units of the mighty German Wehrmacht, ready to drive them back into the sea. Low areas are flooded beyond the beach to drown paratroopers in the event of airborne landing to the rear of the beaches. Hitler, however, puts his ultimate faith in his newly developed secret vengeance weapon, the V-1 robot bomb and the V-2 guided supersonic rocket. He hopes he can perfect and launch enough of these in time. If so, he is confident he can destroy any Allied invasion force and break the will of the stubborn English people at last. Behind the ever-strengthening West Wall waits Rommel and the German army. They will not have long to wait for their ultimate test. Early in May, Eisenhower and his commanders finalized the major invasion plan. Provided the weather is right, June 5th, 6th, or 7th will be D-Day. Only on those days in June would conditions be ideal for invasion. A full moon to light the way for the airborne troops, and a low morning tide for the landing operations on the beaches. If none of the 3 days should prove satisfactory from the standpoint of weather, consequences would ensue that were almost terrifying to contemplate. The good weather period available for major campaigning would become still shorter, and the enemy's defenses would become still stronger. It was a tense period, made even worse by the fact that the one thing that could provide this disastrous setback was entirely outside the Allies' control. As D-Day loomed nearer, invasion plans continued to take shape. In the first hours of D-Day, paratroopers were to be dropped behind coastal defenses to isolate the beaches. Meanwhile, 5,000 ships carrying the main assault forces would rendezvous in mid-channel to await H-hour. At 6:30 a.m., small landing craft will take the troops to the 5 invasion beaches. The Americans will land at Utah and Omaha, the British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Primary objective of the amphibious assault, codenamed Neptune, was to secure a beachhead in Normandy, then capture the port of Cherbourg. Bodyguard machinations continued to spread a web of mystery and confusion over the impending invasion. Intelligence gained through spies and wireless intercepts indicated that the Germans were still uncertain of Allied invasion plans. The presence of 25 Wehrmacht divisions in the Balkans indicated Operation Zeppelin, which suggested the Allies' plan to invade Europe along the Adriatic coast had not been discounted. Similarly, Operation Fortitude North had influenced German command to keep 27 divisions idle in Denmark, Finland, and Norway. In England, preparations were inspected in detail by the highest Allied officials. From the outset, Prime Minister Churchill had clearly and concretely explained his attitude toward and his hopes for Overlord. British experiences at Dunkirk and later at Dieppe had forged strong misgivings in Churchill's mind regarding a cross-channel assault. As the time for the invasion grew nearer, Churchill gradually became more optimistic than he had been earlier, but he still refused to let his expectations completely conquer his doubts. Misgivings regarding U.S. airborne operations were forwarded by British Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. who forecast doom for the men of the 82nd and 101st Divisions, and campaigned strongly to cancel the jumps in the American sector. The suggestion infuriated American generals who saw the airborne assault as crucial to the success of the landings at Utah Beach and the ultimate capture of Cherbourg. As Eisenhower saw it, the paratroopers had been trained to peak condition, both mentally and physically. They were fit and ready to lead the assault on the enemy in France. On April 30th, 1944, all southern England was suddenly sealed off from the rest of the world. The war's most important secret, the time and place of D-Day, must be kept from the enemy. The army camps along the coast were closed. The success of the invasion for all its machines must depend on these men. The outside world would not hear of them again until the 6th of June.
After I got in England, I got in this replacement depot at Camp Houston in Houndstown. The last part of May, I found myself put into the 1st Infantry Division. I thought I was being put in a stockade, but I'd never been court-martialed or anything, so that's what it looked like, a barbed wire fence around them.
These camps were strange, unsightly places that had sprung up almost overnight and were known to their citizens as shanty towns. Buildings were fashioned entirely from heavy boxes and shipping crates used in transporting thousands of gliders from the United States. Every time a glider moved out of its crate, there were impatient tenants waiting to move in and set up housekeeping or perhaps a business establishment. Everyone in town was there for one purpose, for the day when they would join forces with the British to make the big jump. With so many men staged in southern England, an effort to reinforce Operation Vendetta, the bogus Allied plan to invade the Mediterranean coast of France, was launched. In late May of 1944, actor Clifton James, a dead ringer for General Bernard Montgomery, made several high-profile appearances in Gibraltar and Algiers. Designated Operation Copperhead, the presence of Monty in the Mediterranean suggested to the Germans that a cross-channel invasion was not imminent, or that the Allies would indeed assault southern France. While the Germans were left to sort out conflicting reports, security measures at the camps in southern England were stepped up. The only visitors were very important persons. During the weeks before D-Day, General Eisenhower devoted as much of his time as possible to visiting the troops who were to participate in the attack on Fortress Europe. Urged by some to give up or curtail his visits with the troops, Eisenhower refused. It was argued that so far as the mass of men was concerned, Ike could never speak personally to more than a tiny percentage, and he was merely wearing himself out. However, Eisenhower firmly believed that through constant talking to enlisted men, he gained an accurate impression of their state of mind and readiness to go into battle. Ike would talk about anything, so long as he could get the soldier to talk to him in return. One place in England where security measures are intentionally relaxed is at General George Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group headquarters, 20 miles across the channel from Calais. Here at Dover, the flamboyant Patton commands a ghost army comprised of dummy tanks, dummy trucks, and even a mock invasion fleet. Patton, the general most feared by the Germans, stages noisy, highly conspicuous maneuvers in order to make the Germans believe that the invasion will come at Calais. Although Hitler's intuition tells him that the Allied attack may come at Normandy, 100 miles from England, the reports on Patton change his mind. A component of Fortitude South, known as Operation Quicksilver, the Allied deception plan helps convince Hitler that Calais, only 20 miles from England, is the invasion target. Hitler immediately orders panzer units and infantry divisions brought up to strengthen the Calais district. By June, there will be more than 150,000 men ready in Calais to repel the great Allied invasion.
Well, it seems incredible now that the Allies were able to pull this hoax off. But it really all goes back to the breaking the Enigma code early in the war. And as the Germans tried to place agents on the ground in England to give them intelligence, the British were able to intercept when they would be arriving and intercept those agents. But rather than have those German agents just disappear, the British began to, in fact, transmit messages back to the Germans in their own code and feed them, in fact, false information about what is going on in England. And this reinforces the whole bodyguard concept.
To keep the Germans confused about the invasion point, the Allies staged numerous probing maneuvers up and down the French coast. In spite of the enormous effort the Allies had undergone to keep the invasion site secret, there were several serious security breaches that could have tipped off the Germans. By mid-April 1944, hundreds of American and British officers were privy to the innermost secrets of Overlord. These officers and the secret documents they studied were codenamed Bigot. One of these men mistakenly left a briefcase containing Bigot documents on a British train. Although the briefcase was recovered, the incident sent shivers through Allied command. On another occasion, Bigot documents blew out an open window onto the streets of London, and only 9 of the original 10 documents were recovered. Explicit Overlord details were overheard being exchanged at several social gatherings, and a copy of the wireless communications plan for D-Day went AWOL for 2 days. Then came the biggest security fright of all.
In late April of 1944, during Operation Tiger, which is pre-invasion training, German E-boats will get in amongst the Allied landing craft and sink some of them, and will lose over 700 people. Part of that 700 people will be 10 Bigot officers. And there'll be an incredible concern on the part of the Allied High Command that the German E-boats have either captured one or more of these individuals alive as a prisoner, or that they've fished the bodies out of the channel with the information possibly still on their person. So the Allies will put an incredible effort out in the channel to find these 10 missing Bigot officers. And eventually they will recover all 10 of their bodies and allay their suspicions or their fears that the Germans may have gotten them.
At bivouac and training areas, ground troops received their alert orders. In the marshalling area, each man drew a gas mask of the latest type, an instantaneous life belt. Field rations were issued, including cigarettes and candy. Dozens of items to be issued and checked.
A week before the invasion, we left the camp and they put us on an airfield in the vicinity, and we stayed on that airfield for approximately 7 days, and we didn't know where we were going at the time. Then they showed us maps of where we were going without the names. It was only 3 days actually before the invasion that we knew exactly where we were going, that it was going to be France and Normandy.
When the men received French folding money, they knew what was what. Now special briefing officers took over. Each unit was briefed individually. The movement of the initial invasion task force from the marshalling areas to the embarkation points in southeastern England began on May 30th, when Eisenhower issued the code phrase, Exercise +6, indicating the invasion would be 6 days hence. Monday, June 5th, would be D-Day. For the men, the waiting is over. The march to the sea begins. The timetable called for all troops, vehicles, and supplies to be aboard their transports within 5 days. The men were to assemble by the numbers of their ships, and all light vehicles and equipment which were to accompany the assault forces and their ships was to be identified in the same manner to avoid any possibility of a mix-up. On June 1st and 2nd, the troops left their camps and headed directly for the ports of embarkation under the strict surveillance of the military police. This transportation and embarkation schedule, so vital to the whole invasion plan, required the closest possible coordination of times of departure and arrival. The operation was executed with expert skill and efficiency. Morale was high. Toughened, skilled, easy under discipline, the men knew they were ready. Britain was a sea of movement. Shortly before Eisenhower issued his go-ahead, bodyguard authorities dreamed up yet another ploy to reinforce Operation Quicksilver. It was decided to repatriate an ailing German general being held in a Welsh POW camp through a program administered by the Swedish Red Cross. General Hans Kramer, once a leader in Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps, was driven from Wales eastward across England toward London. Escorted by British double-cross agents, the route took Kramer directly through the genuine assembly areas in southwestern and southeastern England. His cordial escorts let slip that they were going through the Dover region, home to Patton's Ghost Army Group, and since road signposts and the names of towns had been obliterated in anticipation of a German invasion years before, General Kramer had no way of knowing otherwise. In London, Patton even hosted a dinner for the German general, mixing into the evening's conversation fleeting references to the Pas-de-Calais. Back in Germany, Kramer rushed to Berlin, where he reported on what he had seen and heard. Since his report dovetailed neatly with other intelligence sources, largely bodyguard contrivances, Kramer's report was accepted as accurate. The southern portion of England was indeed one vast camp, dump, and airfield. It merely wasn't where the Germans had been led to believe. At the request of Schaeff, the British government stopped all traffic between southern England and the remainder of the United Kingdom. These added inconveniences and privations were accepted by the war-weary British public without a whimper. Southern England was tense as a coiled spring, and indeed that is exactly what it was. A great human spring coiled for the moment when its energy should be released and it would vault the English Channel in the greatest amphibious assault ever attempted. Embarkation of men and equipment took place simultaneously at 9 seaports along the southern and southwestern coasts of England. All vehicles and tanks were loaded backwards on LSTs and LCIs. Concrete and cobblestone embarkation lanes known as hards had been constructed to speed loading. All vehicles embarked with gas tanks filled and sufficient extra gas for 150 miles. Navy and Coast Guard crews made last-minute preparations. All English seashore towns through which military forces passed were quarantined as a precaution against the leakage of information. Had the Luftwaffe commanded the skies at this juncture, it could have inflicted heavy damage on our men and ships, concentrated as they were in this relatively small area. Finally, the very heart of the striking force completes the movement. The men who will spearhead the invasion board the ships, which will carry them to their long-awaited hour of decision.
We were moved into a camp just outside Plymouth, and waited there for a couple of days, and then were loaded onto a troop ship, and we moved out into the channel, and we just stayed there for I've forgotten now, probably 2, 3, 4 days, because so much material was moving through the port that they had to get ships out of the port so that more ships could come in and load up this stuff, and along with other troops and so on.
Each man carried one K and one D ration. No extra clothing or barracks bags on this trip. General Eisenhower said of these men, there is no question at all as to the readiness of the troops. They are well-trained, fit, and impatient to get the job started and completed. Small assault boats ran a continuous shuttle service from the hards and docks to the transports lying at anchor in the harbor. The arithmetic of logistics, however, could not have clicked without the spirit of frictionless teamwork which prevailed among the staffs and men of the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard. German reconnaissance flights flew daily missions across the Channel, and part of the cover-up plan allowed them to fly over the Dover area in southeastern England. At the altitude they were flying, the dummy tanks, planes, and landing craft of Patton's Ghost 1st Army Group looked quite realistic. However, any approach these same planes made to southern and southwestern England was driven off by very aggressive fighter activity, and there was a feeling among some German commanders that this indicated the invasion would take place at Normandy.
Now, what this is going to cause is a dichotomy within the German High Command. Some will begin to believe that, in fact, it'll reinforce their opinion that the area of concern is Calais. On the other hand, this will bring to the minds of other German commanders the idea that the real invasion is actually sited somewhere else because of this problem with intelligence gathering. And you'll find, for instance, Rommel will increasingly lobby for the release of panzers and artillery being held in reserve in the Calais area to be released to reinforce the Normandy beaches, which he sees as being increasingly threatened. However, his efforts are in vain, and those requests are not granted.
The last of the ships which were to participate in the D-Day assault were loaded to capacity, and the time for departure from the English coast was finally at hand. With the mechanics of logistics done, the eye of destiny is now on these men who board their vessels, bringing only what they can carry on their backs and in their hearts. They may not see themselves as the sword bearers of a crusade, but they know well enough what depends on their efforts. Now begins a new period of waiting for one final word. An invasion ship is a lonely ship, writes a correspondent who was there. It's a strange and suspended world, but heavy with memories of the more familiar world left behind. Unknown to the men in the tense atmosphere of the invasion fleet, tension is also high at Supreme Headquarters.
June 3rd dawns gray and dull and marks the beginning of the worst channel weather in decades. The first ships are on their way to their rendezvous in the channel when they are hit by unexpected storms. Weather, the one element beyond the control of the Allied High Command, threatens the success of the invasion.
Now all the invasion timing depended on the tide for the landing of troops, moonlight for the airborne, calm seas, and the simultaneous beginning of the new Russian offensive. All the careful planning hangs on the weather report.
Ike refuses to risk disaster and postpones D-Day for at least 24 hours. The advance convoys of the fleet, already en route to invasion, are ordered back. German weather stations track the storm, and their forecasters make the same prediction as the Allied meteorologists. The worst storm in 20 years is approaching the English Channel, and the weather will continue bad for at least a week. Lulled into a sense of security, the German Navy cancels mine-laying operations and its nightly E-boat patrols. All planes are grounded. Rommel estimates that an Allied invasion is not possible during the next 2 weeks. Exhausted from overwork, he decides to go home to Germany for a few days' rest. Besides, Tuesday, June 6th, will be his wife's birthday. In England, at the embarkation ports, the Allied forces are confined to their ships. As the men wait, Eisenhower faces another tortured decision. If the bad weather continues, the invasion will have to be put off until June 19th, when the tide will again be right. And if he does postpone, how can he keep the invasion secrets locked up among 250,000 men? How will the long delay affect their morale? The storm at sea now moved inland, striking southern England with its full fury. The situation looked more hopeless than ever. The Allied weather stations report from far out in the North Atlantic, from Greenland, from places where German meteorologists cannot get information. They predict the possibility that the storm front may lift for a 24-hour period on Tuesday, June 6th, and the news is relayed to Eisenhower's headquarters. In an old English mansion near the invasion harbor of Portsmouth, a dramatic conference takes place. Eisenhower and his commanders meet to consider whether they should launch the invasion on Tuesday. The opinions are divided, some doubtful, some yes. But the final word, the fateful decision, must come from Eisenhower. There's a moment of silence. Then he says, "Okay, let's go. D-Day will be Tuesday, June 6th. From Plymouth and Dartmouth, from Poole and New Haven, from Torquay and Portsmouth they come. Battleships, minesweepers, destroyers, rocket barges, tugboats, and landing craft. More than 6,000 vessels in all. The greatest invasion armada in the history of man. Meanwhile, in Hitler's luxurious mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, the Führer enjoys a peaceful day with his mistress, Eva Braun. He will hold 2 military conferences with his staff and spend the late hours of his evening listening to Wagner. Along the Atlantic Wall, there is nothing unusual to report. All is quiet on the Western Front.
It took 2,172 days to win the Second World War, and the 6th of June, 1944, may be the best remembered. On this D-Day, the Allies sailed on Hitler. The largest combined land, air, and sea operation of all time was launched from bases in southern England to liberate Europe from its Nazi oppressors. Planned by the ablest Allied commanders and spearheaded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion script had come down to this.
In the first hours of D-Day, paratroopers were to be dropped behind coastal defenses to isolate the beaches. Meanwhile, 5,000 ships carrying the main assault forces would rendezvous in mid-channel to await H-hour. At 6:30 a.m., small landing craft will take the troops to the 5 invasion beaches. The Americans will land at Utah and Omaha, the British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Primary objective of the amphibious assault, codenamed Neptune, was to secure a beachhead in Normandy, then capture the port of Cherbourg.
That was the plan. But in spite of the countless hours of preparation that had gone into developing Overlord, the outcome was by no means certain. Had the Germans sifted through the bodyguard cover-up schemes and determined the true invasion site? As little as 48 hours warning might spell disaster. Supremely confident in his men, General Eisenhower expected nothing less than total victory. But as the invasion armada put forth from the ports of southern England, the weight of the world was squarely on his shoulders.
Covered by watchful air fighters, the invasion fleet sailed on the morning of June 5th. American units left their various harbors in southeastern England to meet the British units at a rendezvous off the Isle of Wight. Under complete radio silence, each ship took its proper place in the vast armada. Across the same storm-tossed English Channel, which 356 years earlier had defeated a proud Spanish armada, now steamed over 6,000 ships, converging on France with the precision of a dress parade. The Luftwaffe has been broken, the U-boats driven from the channel. The vanguard of 35 divisions moves unmolested toward the beaches. They were approaching their final positions as the sun began to set. At twilight came the signal for the dash across the channel. Minesweepers cleared 10 lanes through the Germans' mid-channel minefields, and along these safe passages sailed the invasion fleet.
As the invasion fleet puts out to sea, the British and Americans will attempt to again deceive, as part of bodyguard, the German radar installations along the coast. The installations in the Calais area will not be attacked, and there will be a couple of small flotillas equipped with radar deflectors sent north towards Calais to simulate a large invasion fleet approaching. Meanwhile, in the southern Normandy region, the radar sites will be intensely attacked, and on the night of the invasion, Allied bombers will drop huge amounts of chaff to blind the German radar in the southern area. What the Allied planners hope that as the reports of these various contacts and efforts are sent up the chain of command, that they'll coalesce into a fact in the mind of the Germans that the invasion is headed toward Calais.
As the invasion fleet slowly moved through the mid-channel waters toward Normandy, the sea grew incredibly rough. For many of the warriors aboard the vessels pitching helplessly on the rolling water, seasickness is a cruel enemy to be fought before the Germans are ever faced.
The group I was with said we were going out to come back and attack England again. They had been doing that quite a bit. We stayed out overnight. The next morning, they began to get worried a little bit that we weren't attacking England.
By 0200, the vast armada of ships totaling 6,483 vessels of all kinds had reached the assembly area, 10 miles off the coast of Normandy. The immense convoy of seaborne assault forces stood deployed against 50 miles of French coastline. The men who will actually be the first into France are still back on English soil. Paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division are to jump behind enemy lines to secure the flanks of the invasion area. The success of their mission depends upon the rapid destruction of certain key enemy installations. Intelligence officers have warned the Supreme Commander that the airborne assault is too hazardous to succeed. But without it, the landings may fail. Eisenhower faces a crucial decision. Should he risk the slaughter of 3 superb divisions, or should he cancel the drop and imperil the whole invasion? he orders the paratroopers to France. At command departure points, gliders and their tow planes were standing ready for the night's operation. Speeds and altitudes were assigned to tow plane pilots, and glider pilots were given a final briefing on all that was known to intelligence regarding the conditions likely to be found in the drop zones. Each unit's mission was clearly defined. General Eisenhower paid a last-minute visit to the airborne infantry to wish them well. These men were assigned to 6 Pathfinder units. Takeoff, 2310 hours of D-1. Time for the airborne spearhead to get going. 20,000 men are to disembark from 22 airfields. 1,200 transport aircraft and 700 gliders were to be used in the greatest airborne assault in history. Paratroopers filed out of hangars and marched to their planes. Each combat team carried adequate equipment to complete its mission independently, for it was recognized that a night drop into heavily defended enemy territory by such large forces was bound to create a wild state of confusion on both sides. Parapacks of heavy equipment carried under the planes would be released separately. Gliders were loaded with equipment first. Each pilot checked his list of passengers. Paratroopers put on their full load of equipment, adjusting each item with extreme care. To hit the dirt just right with a full load of equipment is a highly specialized business, especially at night. Final check by the jump master, the most particular man in the outfit. Paratroopers board their planes. Lead packs containing demolition supplies will be released by the men while in midair. Thus, each man will hit the dirt close to his pack. Climbing into the transports, some of the men were so loaded down that they had to be shoved on board by other paratroopers. The crucial hours of darkness ahead will make almost superhuman demands on them. Bad weather and anti-aircraft fire will scatter many of them over a much wider distance than is planned. In small groups and on unfamiliar terrain, they will be forced to fight the enemy as they find them in the night. But dawn will find the flanks at either end of the Normandy battlefield held by these first invaders. None of this, of course, can they know as they board their planes in the late hours before D-Day. With the roar of engines, the Pathfinder ships began taking off. Each Pathfinder unit carried navigation beacons to guide the transports in, and lights to aid jump masters in determining when to send their men out.
Mission, I was part of the defense platoon. It was called the defense platoon of the 82nd Airborne. We were guarding the division headquarters where General Gavin at the time was. Our mission was to assemble and guard the division headquarters.
I was there on the ship, and I heard the planes going over. Initially, those were the paratroopers, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions. And then we knew something was really up.
We left England and started to flow around for about 1 hour. Then the plane started going in one direction, then we flew over the water. The moon was out, I remember, but there were clouds. So there were times that you could see and times where it was very dark. At one point, there was anti-aircraft fire coming from one of the islands in the channel, and the order was given to stand up and hook up. I was number 2 in the plane, which was facing the doorway. So we stood up, hook up, and hang on to the cable. And I can remember one thing I know for sure. I stood like that for 45 minutes. That's a very long time. At one time, our plane got caught in anti-aircraft fire, and the plane dove for the treetops. I think that must have been just about where the point where we were going to jump. And before we knew it, we were over the water on the other side again. Then the plane turned around, flew over the coast again, inland from the other side, flew a few minutes, and gave us the green light, and we jumped. The result of the jump is that naturally we jumped in the wrong place. We didn't know where we were, and it was pretty much of a mess. Since we jumped out of the plane while the plane is going, that means you spread out over pretty close, 3/4 of a mile or so. And you reassemble against the middle. We had the heavy equipment such as machine guns, bazookas, and BARs in equipment bundles under the plane. They were released under the plane. They were spread out. So it took quite a while for all the men to gather together and go find this equipment, which was spread out all over. Nothing went according to plan, but I think the result was just as good. The men were spread out all over the place, but it was just as well. It was really mass confusion from the Germans because since we were all over the place, they didn't know how many we were. Every time they turned around, they'd run into us.
The Allies knew the invasion was most vulnerable in its early stages. If able to land enough troops and establish deep enough penetration, it would be difficult for the Germans to dislodge them. The first few days and weeks would tell the story. Allied High Command was aware that the Germans expected the invasion to take place at Calais, and Operation Fortitude South went to great lengths to further this perception. But to maintain the deception once Neptune was fully underway was quite another matter. It was imperative to keep the German High Command confused as to the nature and scope of the Normandy landings.
Titanic is a code name for an airborne deception plan that the Allies put on. What they do is they drop British commandos with record players and amplifiers in behind German lines that have recorded sounds of airborne landings and gunfire on them. And in conjunction with those landings, they also drop thousands of dummy half-sized dummy paratroopers over France, both in the invasion area and on a wider front. And the result of these drops is to confuse the Germans and cause them to dispatch troops to deal with these theoretical airborne landings. And what that does is disperses their strength, causes the real airborne landings to meet less opposition, and also draws troops away from the beaches that will not be there to defend against the landings.
In the early morning of June 6th, the first group of gliders were pulled off the ground and towed out across the channel to be cut loose over the area where the paratroopers had dropped earlier. The heavily armed men in them a short while before had listened to a message from the Supreme Commander. You're about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you, as are the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. I have every confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. The first lifts of gliders to come in had their share of difficulties. In the American sector, the second glider in managed to wipe out all of the landing lights that had been set up by the Pathfinders. Like their paratroop counterparts, many gliders were scattered well away from their intended landing zones. Almost all were heavily damaged, but the majority of the jeeps, ammunition, and artillery pieces they carried were delivered intact.
The first person I met turned out to be a member of the 101st Airborne. He had a cricket, you know, the metal thing that goes click, click, was going. I was hearing this click, click all over the place, wondering what it was. We had a password, so I give him a password he's supposed to answer to me, and he answered by click, click. And I didn't know anything about this click, click. It turned out to be a disaster there. Anyway, nobody was trigger happy, so he went on his way. He was disgusted. He wasn't the one I was looking for. He went away, click, click, click. And I went my own way trying to find the rest of the men I jumped with, and I eventually found them. We were heading for Sainte-Mère-Église, and we finally reached the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. It must have been about 8 o'clock in the morning.
Sainte-Mère-Église was the first town to be captured by the American paratroopers early on D-Day morning.
Sainte-Mère-Église is a town with a square with a church and trees. And when we walked in, I can remember there were paratroopers, dead paratroopers hanging in the trees. Unfortunately, they landed, their parachute got caught in the trees, and the town had been occupied by the Germans.
In addition to seizing key spots to facilitate the advance of the major forces, the airborne troops proved even more invaluable as scouts.
I was used as an interpreter to find out, to ask questions about what the Germans were, how many they were, what units they had, what type of equipment, none.
The entire airborne effort is really assisted in part by a lack of an aggressive German response. Although there's localized stiff resistance in certain areas, generally speaking, the Germans are very slow to react to the airborne landings behind the Normandy beaches. The airborne divisions were able to accomplish their primary objectives, which was the seizure of key beach exits in the American sector and critical bridges behind the British sector. They were also able to accomplish their secondary mission, which was the screening of the landings early on the morning of the 6th.
Meanwhile, in the rough waters of the Channel, the giant invasion fleet was proceeding carefully toward the French coast. One of the most important and dirtiest of preparatory jobs was done by the minesweepers, which moved in and exploded mines just off the coast, clearing safe channels for the assault boats. Virtually every type of light assault vessel was pressed into use for the operation. The invasion armada, with its complement of over 6,000 ships and small craft, carried 150,000 troops, thousands of vehicles and weapons, and tons of supplies. In spite of close quarters in the Channel, the vast invasion fleet made the crossing successfully, suffering the loss of not a single vessel by German action. The GIs and Navy gun crews waited expectantly for an enemy air attack, but not one German plane appeared. The Germans, though surprised by our attack in relatively rough weather, were quick to contest the invasion. The coastal defenses, which they had spent years in preparing for this moment, were readied for action. While the troops prepared to go ashore, the savage battle for domination of the beaches started. Streams of heavy, medium, light, and fighter bombers crossed the Channel for the most intensive airstrike of the entire war. Shattering the dawn 90 minutes before H hour, the aerial bombardment began. Charged with the responsibility of demolishing selected targets in the enemy's coastal defenses, providing overhead cover, and rendering general fighter bomber support, the air plan sought to isolate the battle area until the ground forces could consolidate the beachheads and begin the breakthrough. Other fire support was available as offshore warships prepared to open the Western Front with a barrage of gunfire. Some 600 Allied warships trained their heavy guns on any German coastal defenses that had not been knocked out by the Allied air bombardment. Battleship Nevada is there, torpedoed at Pearl Harbor, a flagship at Normandy. At 05:30, 1 hour before touchdown of the ground troops, the naval guns open up. The enemy had long known he would be invaded, but he did not know when or where. The answer resounded with deafening clarity from the ships standing off the Normandy coast. Inside Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the Germans know what the world does not. The assault is on. Defeated in the north, defeated in the south, defeated in the east, the Germans have but one hope left: destroy the invaders from the west. More shell tonnage was expended in the next hour than in all the Allied naval campaigns of World War I. Each warship had its assigned targets. It was acknowledged that dust and smoke from the aerial bombing would obscure shore targets, so fire was based on map coordinates and according to strict timetables. While the battle raged on, the transports prepared to send their troops ashore. The infantry had spent 18 wretched hours on the pitching sea, and the vomit bags were gone. Now, in the calmer offshore waters, the nausea was lifting. Strangely, the fear was evaporating. The terrible waiting was over. There was nothing left to do but go and fight. "48-hour rations, some French money, a rifle, and the last few soggy jokes." The waves are high, the clouds are low and threatening. but by dawn, all the convoys are unloading their human and mechanical cargo into landing craft. In a world of nausea and tension, the trip to the beaches begins. At the spear tip of this historic seaborne attack are some 3,000 men, American, British, and Canadian troops who will hit in the first wave. Behind them, the main body of ground forces will land in succeeding waves. The naval gunners raised their sights as the assault boats went in and smashed at the enemy's gun batteries farther inland. Yet so ingeniously fortified was this coastal zone that despite the deluge of bombs and shells from our air and sea bombardment, enemy counterfire was still effective as our men neared the beaches. After the planes and warships had done their jobs, the final outcome of the mighty battle depended largely on the infantrymen. The GIs and the landing boats were fully aware that they were the center of attention. Loaded with 32 men each, the landing craft start the run for the beach. D-Day, H-Hour, that fateful moment for which the whole world held its breath. The invasion was on. At 06:30, the first landing craft touched down on Utah Beach. A strong current worked in favor of the Americans at Utah, carrying the landing some 2,000 yards south of the intended landing sites. The obstacles at that point were far less formidable, and quick thinking exploited the situation. Men were fed into the area, thereby avoiding heavier losses that might have been suffered at the intended landing point. Shocked by the bombardment and the overwhelming numbers of men waiting ashore, many German defenders at Utah surrendered at first contact. The initial landings were very quickly accomplished. Link up with members of the 101st Airborne was rapid. The 101st had secured 4 exits off the beach, and by the end of D-Day, they had a beachhead 6 miles deep. The Once off the beach, however, flooded land behind the landing slowed the American advance to a crawl. Of the 23,000 men landed at Utah, only 197 casualties were taken on D-Day.
While everything is right on Utah Beach, to the southeast, nearly everything goes wrong on the 4-mile stretch of beach designated Omaha. For the 8 companies of men coming into Omaha Beach, the Rommel nightmare begins to come true. It's here that the bloodiest battle of D-Day was being fought.
It was anticipated that Omaha would be difficult. Dominated by sheer 100-foot cliffs at either end, the narrow beach was heavily strewn with obstacles and backed by a seawall and a steep bank of coarse pebbles impassable to vehicles in most places. The only way off the beach was through 5 narrow draws. To make matters worse, the formidable 352nd Infantry Division had been brought up to reinforce the area, and as a result, the Americans at Omaha faced 8 enemy battalions rather than the 4 they had planned on. The troops at Omaha were in trouble from the outset. Landing craft and amphibious transports foundered on the 12-mile run inshore, carrying hundreds of men and dozens of artillery pieces to the bottom. The first wave of men hitting the beach at Normandy had no armor and no heavy guns to support them in the face of murderous enemy fire. Only a few German positions had been seriously damaged during the preliminary bombardment, and German artillery tore into the landing craft as they approached, causing some to sink. Unable to swim due to their heavy equipment, many men drowned.
As we were going into the beach on this landing craft, Coxman or whatever he was running the thing, he got up to the beach and he says, "I can't let the ramp down. I'm going to have to back out in deeper water. And you're going to have to go over the side." So he backed out into the water where it was about 8 feet deep, I guess, and we bailed out over the sides, and then there were shells flying over our heads. I was in with the first wave. They called it Easy Red. I was in it.
As the ramps of the first landing craft dropped, the American line was raked by machine gun fire from one end to the other. Amid sinking tanks and exploding landing craft raked by machine gun fire, those who survived the initial onslaught plunged into water waist to neck deep and began wading ashore, taking cover behind the very obstacles built to deter the landings. In the confusion, boats went astray or got out of control and crashed into one another. Forced to jump out of sinking boats, many men had to discard their weapons and equipment to save themselves from drowning. Dragged from the frigid water, they were in no condition to battle the Germans.
The assault on Omaha was rapidly becoming a shambles. The engineers assigned to clear and mark lanes through the obstacles were unable to because troops refused to leave the cover they offered. When subsequent waves came in, they only added to the chaos. The losses in the first hour were awesome.
As the tide crept in, so too did the Americans. Those who had successfully negotiated the beach found themselves pinned down below the seawall or the pebble bank at the top of the beach.
It isn't too clear what I was doing, but I got in on the beach and I knew that I didn't want to stay there. There was too many others laying around there and wounded and so forth. So as we was coming up the beach, there's this cliff off to our right. This cliff was pretty high, and when I come up off of the beach, I noticed a lot of fellas is hugging up there against this cliff to keep out of the shelling. And I was told later that that was the Point du Hoc.
Exhausted, shocked, uncertain what to do in the face of relentless enemy fire, the bewildered troops were slow to move off the beaches. Officers who tried to rally the men ran from group to group, promptly becoming targets. At the risk of hitting American troops, destroyers swept in to provide direct artillery support for the infantry. All morning they fired, and into the afternoon, delivering an endless barrage of thunderous salvos. It was almost 1000 before there was any confirmation that even one soldier had set foot on Omaha.
The men of the 2 British and 1 Canadian divisions that landed on D-Day faced terrain far less formidable than that at Omaha. The gently sloping beach was backed by a series of small summer resorts, and behind the resorts lay open, flat terrain. The fortunes of the British and Canadians on Gold, Sword, and Juno were dictated in large part by a threat the Americans did not have to face: tanks. The British knew at least 1 Panzer division stood between them and their primary D-Day objectives: capturing the heavily fortified city of Caen and securing the Allied eastern flank. A rapid move inland would be necessary to withstand an anticipated assault by German panzers.
The British fired at fortified houses as they came in, smashing many a sniper's nest and observation posts. In the British sector, special duty engineers were to hit the beach first, with the medics and infantry following. The British 30 Corps was responsible for Gold Beach on the extreme west of the British sector. Their objective was Bayeux. First ashore were the flail tanks that cleared lanes through barbed wire and minefields for the infantry. Then, shortly before 0730, the gates of the landing craft clanged open. How the British soldiers fared at Gold had much to do with where they landed. Some came ashore to little opposition, while others suffered greatly before resolute defenders. On the extreme right, troops of the British 50th Division ran into the easternmost parts of the German 352nd Infantry Division, which was giving the Americans so much trouble on Omaha. Despite attacking over better terrain, the British fared little better. Troops arriving in the second wave found scattered concentrations of bodies and spreading stains of blood clotting in the sand. Still, after a few hours, men of the 50th cut the Bayeux-Caen road, preventing tanks from reaching the vulnerable Americans on Omaha. At Juno Beach, the center of the British sector, high seas had wreaked havoc on the assault boats. 20 of the first 24 landing craft carrying elements of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division were lost or damaged due to mines or shore obstacles. Like the Americans on Omaha, the Canadians lost most of their armored and artillery support on the run-in shore. The Germans at Juno were not as quick to fold as on Utah. Advances were made through the practice of bypassing pockets of resistance which lead troops were engaging. Canadian troops succeeded in linking up on their right with the British on Gold to form a solid beachhead 12 miles long and 6 miles deep by the day's end. But the left flank was still separated from the British on Sword by 2.5 miles of enemy-held territory.
Sword Beach, a naval port guarded by heavy gun emplacements, was where the real danger lurked in the British sector. Somewhere behind the beach, tanks of the 21st Panzer Division awaited the 3rd British Infantry Division.
The landing at Sword went relatively smoothly, and by 1600 the troops, with tanks and some anti-tank guns, had advanced to within 3 miles of their D-Day objective, the city of Caen. But there, the advance stalled when 40 powerful Mark IV Panzers were encountered, and the first big tank battle of the invasion erupted. When the two forces disengaged, the British pressed on toward Caen. and were finally stopped only 2 miles from the town by intense German fire. As the British dug in for the night, no one could have known that it would be weeks before Caen would finally fall.
Throughout the early stages of Neptune, the German High Command remained oblivious to the landings. Field Marshal Rommel was at home, and Adolf Hitler and his Chief of Staff, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, were both sound asleep. It was not until after noon that reserves were authorized to reinforce the Normandy sector. The lack of swift action was due largely to fortitude south. German intelligence reported that among the troops landing at Normandy, no units of Patton's fictional 1st U.S. Army Group were present. The notion that Normandy continued to be viewed as a sideshow was confirmed by the Allied architects of Bodyguard.
In England, as the invasion goes in, signal operators are listening to the German radio communications. And what they're listening for is the German code words, which is initiate case 3, which is the German signal for the commitment of the mobile reserves to contest the beach landings. However, the German High Command is convinced that this Normandy invasion is simply a deception or part of the Allied diversionary plan, and that signal is never sent.
The main event was far to the southwest in Normandy, and of all the beaches, it was on Omaha Beach that the struggle was fiercest, the outcome most in doubt. Fortunately for the men on the beaches, they were not fighting alone. On D-Day, 10,000 flights of aircraft battered German defenses with more than 11,000 tons of bombs. Behind the landings, Allied planes release a barrier of bombs that cut off German reinforcements, paralyze German counter moves. Every road, every bridge, every rail line, every canal, all the way back into Germany was smashed, isolating French beaches. The fury from the air went on and on. Pilots in tactical support of the ground forces took no rest that day. Back from one sortie, they gassed up, loaded their bombs and ammunition belts, and grimly went out again and again. By 1100, the battle at Omaha was finally beginning to flow for the Americans. Convinced that enemy fire was not going to get any lighter by waiting, coordinated efforts began to move forward. At the exits to the beach, fresh troops and newly landed tanks began to capture German strongpoints weakened by the ferocious aerial and naval bombardment. Finally, at 13:30, V Corps was able to radio 1st Army Commander Bradley on board the cruiser Augusta that troops formerly pinned down on the beaches were advancing inland. When darkness fell, V Corps clung to a precarious beachhead 6 miles long and less than 2 miles deep. Already the Americans had sustained 3,000 casualties. The tenuous hold on Omaha would depend on what the Germans could throw against the landing in the days to follow.
There were rumors, as there always are in the Army, of course, or in the service. We did hear that they landed successfully and that they were moving inland.
Allied advance throughout the French coastal area was slowed down considerably by German obstacles. The entire region had been liberally planted with mines, and detection units reaped an abundant harvest on the country near the beaches. Once cleared, the troops could again move forward, but for many, it went from bad to worse. The troops who struggled off the beaches ran into yet another formidable barrier, the hedgerows of Normandy, which would become so notorious in the coming weeks. It seemed nearly every hedgerow contained a German sharpshooter determined to make the Americans pay a steep price as they worked inland.
Part of the invasion's success lay in the German reaction to the ongoing bodyguard deception plan. Allied radio broadcasts on Invasion Day, all carefully scripted, deliberately referred to the landings as preliminary in nature and just one phase of a grand invasion plan. Winston Churchill, while addressing the Parliament, furthered the deception, calling the invasion the first in a series of planned landings. German High Command was paralyzed, convinced that Normandy was the first and probably lightest of the blows to come. Accordingly, reserves were kept out of the battle, including the formidable panzer divisions. The overall result could not have been better.
With the tide of battle beginning to flow in favor of the Allies, Troop Carrier Command was ready for its next move. They had amassed hundreds of British and American gliders in preparation for the most gigantic aerial towing job ever attempted. Each held a full cargo of jeeps and guns and the fighting men to use them. The lives and success of those who were already in France depended on the flight of this vast armada. Reinforcements were needed to relieve the units already ashore in Normandy, some of which had been under direct enemy attack since they landed. An unbroken chain of planes and gliders stretching from England to France and back again carried with it the men and material necessary to sustain the invasion. As the aerial fleet sailed out over the channel, it was extremely vulnerable to air attack. This was the Luftwaffe's big chance. The Allied air forces had established air supremacy, and the gliders and their tugs were covered by an umbrella of fighters. But if there was ever a time that German flyers would try anything to break through, this was the time. Yet not a single German plane was encountered. The second glider lift was scheduled to go in during the last hours of daylight in support of the paratroops landed before H hour. Medics, radio personnel, and a large number of troops sailed over the invasion beaches, oblivious to the carnage below them. In addition to their substantial human cargo, the gliders carried jeeps, ammunition, supplies, bulldozers, and artillery pieces, notably anti-tank guns. Approaching the French coast, German anti-aircraft fire opened up. In one lift of 50 glider-tug combinations bound for the American sector, 37 of the C-47 tug aircraft were hit and 2 others shot down. Landing Zone W was still in German hands as the last lifts came in, and attempts to divert them failed. They came down to a hail of fire. "15-foot poles driven into the ground ripped off wings and smashed through fuselages. Yet those broken wings served the highest purpose. They carried an army into Normandy." By late afternoon, the coastal region had become an enormous staging area. Standing offshore, LSTs unloaded supplies onto smaller LCTs. Heavier equipment was transferred to giant rhino ferries, flat-bottom barges that were landed ashore. And with the armor and supplies came reinforcements, thousands of men to strengthen and broaden the landing. Out in the Channel, rescue boats of the Coast Guard searched for survivors and aided damaged vessels, while the hospital ships received load after load of the dead and wounded. The beach was firmly in Allied hands, and the vast extent of the operation was plainly visible. Defeated and disarmed, the first German soldiers captured in France await evacuation.
The assault phase of Operation Overlord was a tremendous victory for the Allies. While the German High Command had looked to the Pas de Calais, more than 150,000 men and hundreds of tanks had landed in Normandy without a single massed counterattack. 6 beachheads were established, despite the punishing fire from Rommel's Atlantic Wall defense. With the troops moving inland everywhere, it was apparent that the gamble had paid off. The Allies had won their foothold on the continent.
But the victory had come at a high cost. Apparent everywhere was the silent evidence of a fierce battle. Nearly 12,000 casualties were taken on D-Day, with losses on Omaha Beach being especially heavy. 3,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing there on that first day alone. Behind the survivors lay those who died to enslave the world, and those who died to free it.
This is the National News Bulletin, a summary of the day's news. The dagger pointed at the heart of Berlin has been driven into the side of Nazi Europe. The first news of the mightiest military operation of all history came at 38 minutes past midnight, Eastern Daylight Time, last night, when the Germans broadcast a report that Le Havre was being bombarded. The official account is rounded out by dispatches from correspondents. They say that Canadian, American, and British troops landed on the Normandy coast in northern France. One report indicates...
One memorable day, the Allies were across the English Channel, their feet at last on the Normandy beaches. Soon after, they were lighting the skies of liberated Paris. And perhaps only those who were there, or whose lives were changed by what happened there, remember that 80 days of war and its uncertainty laid between the two events. History waited on the men trapped in the mud-soaked fields of Normandy until they were able to break out of that agony of isolation and move toward their destiny, changing history's course.
The cross-channel attack beginning on the 6th of June had accomplished the first phase of the invasion. The second phase called for the Allies to expand their foothold. They needed space to maneuver, room to handle the large amounts of men and materials streaming over from England. The first objective then was to merge all the beachheads into one, and together 50 miles of men would drive on beyond the red sands through the broken wall. On June 7th, General Eisenhower, accompanied by his naval commander-in-chief Admiral Ramsey, toured the assault area offshore by destroyer. The weather had improved considerably, making it possible for the Allies to follow up their initial success by quickly landing reinforcements and large quantities of material. And in the ports of England, wave after wave is mounted to build and broaden the landings. The Allied Expeditionary Naval Forces execute their mission to assure the safe and timely arrival of troops, weapons, and supplies. A mission which will have a profound effect on the history of man.
Late on D+2, we were loaded on landing craft personnel and moved into the beaches. There were still bodies in the water, and we could see all kinds of debris from the invasion, and we really admired, you couldn't help but admire what those guys must have gone through, trying to hide behind anti-tank barriers and so on to move in on the coast.
The period from D-Day to a decisive breakout was a crucial phase of the Allied operation. After the Allies landed, the battle never settled down except in isolated spots to anything resembling the trench warfare of the First World War. But it was a possibility that could never be forgotten. General Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg would be difficult. His estimate was 10 days if all went well, 30 days if not. All such predictions depended, of course, upon the success of maintaining the scheduled buildup. Landing tables provided in great detail for the daily and hourly arrival of every kind of fighting unit. Sandwiched in between were ammunition and other supplies required not only for the daily operations, but to begin building the reserves necessary to sustain continuous action once the battle had entered its decisive stage. Until Cherbourg could be captured, the entire invasion would need to be supplied over the beaches, a difficult proposition should bad weather settle in the area. To solve this problem and provide a means for sheltering beach supply from the effects of storms, the Allies undertook the construction of artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. Known as mulberries, these man-made harbors were a marvel of engineering. Both the British and American sectors had one of the mulberry ports. Each consisted of several main components, 3 of which were breakwaters. A chain of inflated rubber bags, known as bombardons, would absorb the force of offshore waves. Within this outer perimeter, phoenixes, which were hollow concrete barges 5 stories high, and gooseberries, obsolete merchant ships, were positioned and sunk, forming the outer walls of the mulberry ports. Ships would enter through the gaps between them and discharge their cargoes onto floating pier heads. The supplies would then be driven ashore via floating roadways. Completed the week following the invasion, the mulberry harbors allowed ships and landing craft to unload in any except the most vicious weather. Elaborate equipment to facilitate unloading and other types of gear required in the operation of a modern port were planned for and provided. The Allies had simultaneously to build up terrific reserves in troops, ammunition, and supplies before any sustained offensive action could be undertaken. By D+12, almost 600,000 men and 90,000 vehicles were on the beaches, massed for the drive inland. As in every campaign in World War II, one of the first orders of business following the invasion was the quick construction of airfields from which to support the advance of the ground forces. Experienced construction units built new airfields on the continent as fast as they were called for. In each case, the strips were in use in a miraculously short time after the men started work. Since D+4, RAF fighter squadrons had been operating from the windy beaches of Normandy.
In Normandy, when we were going in, the Luftwaffe made token raids on the beaches. And I say token, usually it was maybe 2 or 3 planes. And they would fly very low to avoid any aircraft, and they'd fly right along the beach. But they were very ineffective. And by that time, the air power of Germany had been just decimated, and there were no threats whatsoever.
Less than a week after the assault troops had stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches, General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, was the host for an inspection tour of the area by several visitors from Washington. He arranged to take General Marshall, Admiral King, General Arnold, and a group from their respective staffs into the beachhead during the day on June 12th. Their presence, as they roamed around the areas with every indication of keen satisfaction, was heartening to the troops. Eisenhower believed the importance of such visits by high command could scarcely be overestimated in terms of their value to the soldiers' morale.
The Overlord plan had been overwhelmingly concerned with the assault phase and the creation of a beachhead from which to build for the subsequent campaign in Northwest Europe. Less attention had been paid to the conduct of operations once Allied forces were established ashore. The result was that for the first month of operations in Normandy, American forces were poorly positioned to exploit their mobile striking power.
The Americans found themselves beset by the bocage, a murderous labyrinth of sunken roads and thick hedgerows, tailor-made for defense. The presence of the bocage made rapid progress inland nearly impossible, and the American forces advancing on Cherbourg were forced to cut back on armor in favor of infantry and ammunition.
These hedgerows were made up of the Frenchmen clearing the property off and piling the rocks as sort of a boundary line for his property, and then vines and stuff would grow in these rocks, and that's what they called a hedgerows, and some of them might be 3 feet high, and some of them might be 8 feet high, and that's what we had to get through.
To aid the movement of Allied armor in the bocage, an ingenious sergeant named Cullen invented what became known as the rhinoceros tank. By fitting scythe-like blades of steel to a tank's snout, tanks were able to cut through the hedgerows by ramming into them with a good head of steam. In almost every row were hidden machine gunners or small combat teams who were in perfect position to decimate our infantry as they doggedly crawled and crept to the attack along every avenue of approach. The Germans knew the capture of Cherbourg was vital to the Allies and swiftly drew their forces into tight defensive groups to contest the issue. This gathering of German strength was achieved in the face of overwhelming Allied air superiority, and many units were somewhat worse for wear by the time they reached the front. The Americans moved slowly up the Codename Peninsula, and on June 12th, they captured Carentan, linking up the forces from Omaha and Utah. But they were still nowhere near Cherbourg.
We went out every day on patrols. I think I was all over the Normandy to gather information. I spoke French. I also was a demolition expert. We had captured some German equipment, and we had some very odd German equipment that was a motorcycle with a couple of tracks on each side, in which one was riding the motorcycle, 2 of us were in the back. So we used to go out, usually 6 men.
While German defense forces fight the Allies in the hedgerows, the Axis supply units, made up mostly of veterans wounded previously on other fronts, rush ammunition to the Normandy sector. One of the divisions present in Normandy is the Hitler Jugend.
The Hitler Jugend Division is a division made up of the most extreme and hardcore members of the Hitler Youth movement from Germany. And these are very dedicated young men who are very imbued in the cult of Hitler, and they're very deeply Nazi in their orientation. Now, the Americans will capture some of these soldiers, and to them it'll be a joke that there's such young men out there fighting. And they'll keep them overnight, take their weapons away, turn them around, send them back to the German lines saying, "You're too young, go home, you shouldn't be here fighting." And they'll go back to the German lines, simply get new weapons, and turn around and fight the Americans again.
General Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg was going to be a rather nasty job and counted on speed and boldness as much as upon the strength of his assaulting forces to gain an early decision in that area. The combination of the bocage country and determined enemy resistance had instead reduced gains to a matter of yards. American GIs of the 7th Corps assigned to the job encountered stiff resistance from the defending German garrison. After 2 weeks, the German defense of Cherbourg had inflicted severe casualties upon Allied forces. On June 19th, a tremendous storm struck Normandy. Amid the havoc, the Navy and the shore parties did their best to keep supplies moving, but there was little they could do. The storm stopped nearly all landing activities on the beaches for a period of 4 days and interfered seriously with every operation. What the might of the German Army, Navy, and Air Force was unable to do, the worst Channel storm in 80 years almost does. But the invaders hold the beaches. When the winds finally died, the American Mulberry Harbor was destroyed and the British facility badly damaged. It was decided to make all further deliveries in the American sector over the open beaches. And in the coming weeks, the Americans were to achieve daily delivery totals which exceeded those made through the elaborate machinery of the artificial port.
Amazingly, the Allied descent on Normandy had done nothing to resolve the German High Command's quandary regarding Allied invasion plans. The 15th Army was still in the Pas de Calais, and the limited number of replacements flowing into the area scarcely kept up with losses. Allied aircraft controlled not only the skies above the battlefields, but also the approach routes to a depth of 100 miles. Many German units sent to the Normandy front were decimated by enemy aircraft before they ever reached the front.
Allied aircraft flew more than 67,000 offensive and 37,000 defensive sorties in direct support of the beachhead between D-Day and the end of June, whereas the Luftwaffe could manage just over 13,000. Allied control of the sky above Normandy also made possible the use of small, unarmed reconnaissance planes. These small planes proved invaluable in spotting enemy strongpoints on the advance toward Cherbourg. Before Allied big guns went into action to soften up the German positions, target coordinates had been relayed from the Army planes circling overhead.
We had a Piper Cub that flew around doing artillery observing, and he would land behind us there in France, and he would gather up the hand grenades and rifle grenades that he could from us. Then when he'd take off, he'd fly up and over the Germans just a few yards out from us. He would drop hand grenades and rifle grenades as his bombing. We call him our 1st Division bomber.
By June 20th, the Americans stood outside Cherbourg, but it took 6 days of siege before the city surrendered. Strongly fortified in the 19th century, Cherbourg's defenses had been improved by the Germans, who studded all approaches with concrete pillboxes. In the end, the Americans had to fight from street to street and from house to house.
It's no fun fighting in the town. Although you have places where you can hide and so on, or to make any movement at all, you usually have to expose yourself in the street or where you're in a line of fire from the enemy. It becomes very difficult because you can be in a room of a house and right in the next room will be the enemy. And you never know when a grenade will be tossed through a window or when an artillery shell will slam into you, and it's a very difficult fighting. It's not unlike fighting in a hedgerow, really, because again, I think the enemy has a little advantage in that when you try to move forward, he usually has a better line of sight, and the aggressor is always exposed.
Cherbourg finally fell on June 27th, just 3 weeks after D-Day. Ordered to defend the city to the man, Major General Karl von Schlieben finally surrendered, reasoning that further sacrifice would not alter anything. The area yielded some 45,000 German prisoners. The Germans had gone to great lengths to render the harbor unusable, and it took Allied engineering battalions 3 weeks to clear it. With the capture of Cherbourg, the Allies at last had a major port on the French coast, and supplies could be landed in ever-increasing numbers.
After the fall of Cherbourg, Field Marshal von Rundstedt viewed the situation with despair. The enemy would now have unlimited supplies while his own were dwindling perilously. From his headquarters in Paris, he suggested the German High Command make peace with the Allies. An infuriated Hitler replaced von Rundstedt with Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, who vowed his commitment to the unconditional holding of the present defense line.
Before the Allies undertook their decisive attack toward the border of Germany, they had wanted this area as a base. But 3 weeks after the invasion, they had only a tiny beachhead. The greatest single disappointment of the invasion had been the inability to take Caen, which blocked the approaches to the Seine. But the British troops attempting to capture this city had been thwarted. The British failure to secure Caen and the lack of progress along the entire British front was in sharp contrast to the gains that had been made in the American sector. The initial British intention to rush Caen had never materialized, and subsequent attacks had been thwarted. Here it was the Germans feared a quick breakthrough to the River Seine, and here it was they massed their armies best, including 10 of the 12 divisions of armor. Montgomery's tactical handling of the British and Canadians on the eastward flank involved the kind of work in which he excelled. The morale of his forces remained high in spite of frustrations and losses that could easily have shaken troops under a commander in whom they did not place their implicit trust. For weeks, the battle for Caen raged, but the Germans continued to hold on under Montgomery's heaviest assaults. The best hope now lay in the ability of the American forces to strike south and then west and take the key ports in the province of Brittany. A major impediment to this course of action remained the terrain the troops would have to fight through. The area consisted of marshy land enclosed into thousands of separate little fields, again separated by those notorious hedgerows. And what of the Germans who faced the Allies in the soggy fields of Normandy? They were disheartened, certainly, by the success of the Allied landings. Moreover, the German people were exhausted after 5 years of war and with the effort of fighting on 5 fronts. But the troops themselves were far from beaten. They were skillful, tough, and seasoned by experience.
We would try to find a spot where maybe there wasn't any resistance. And to do this, you had to expose yourself. In the infantry, you have scouts and so on that you send out. It was an awful lot to ask a guy to say, okay, I want you to go and scout out this next hedgerow, because the chances of him coming back were very slim.
The Germans had a new weapon, the deadly V-1 buzz bomb, which had begun to fall on England in the middle of June. The V-1 was a small, pilotless airplane which flew at high speed on a predetermined course and terminated its flight by means of setting in its mechanism. The V-1 contained a large amount of explosive which detonated upon contact. The blast effect was terrific. Every means at hand was used to try to destroy them before they landed. By the end of the summer, V-1 attacks had taken over 6,000 lives and destroyed 75,000 buildings. A supersonic V-2 rocket was even more devastating than the V-1 and was almost ready for operational use. These weapons gave the Germans hope of redressing their discouraging situation. Adolf Hitler was himself directing the war. Believing that eventually the Germans would be able to launch a large-scale offensive which would drive the Allies from the continent, he planned in the meantime to pin them down in Normandy and prevent them from using their mobile power. Although some of his commanders now recommended limited withdrawals to make their defense position stronger, Hitler refused. To withdraw for any reason at this time seemed to him to admit defeat. So as American forces prepared to strike across the hedgerow lowland where the Germans had erected strong defenses, Hitler announced that those defenses were to be held. The American attack began in the dawn hours of July 3rd, and it lasted for 17 rain-soaked, agonizing days. The soggy hedgerow terrain immobilized the mechanized power of the ground forces. The slow, painful advance was measured in yards, a hedgerow at a time. Like the steady rain that fell over the entire operation, a sense of despair and frustration touched all those who participated. To offer a lift to morale, General Eisenhower personally decorated a number of GIs who had distinguished themselves in battle.
I can only remember one man who got an extra stripe, was a platoon sergeant. The only thing you got is what everybody got, the ETO ribbon with the battle stars, so for each battle, arrowhead for the jump and things like that. But everybody went in as a private and left as a private.
The need for nourishing food and sufficient rest became matters of primary concern for even the most hardened combat soldiers. If they were to stay in good fighting trim, these needs had to be satisfied periodically, even though it meant they had to be pulled out of the lines in a tough campaign. Meanwhile, on the British front, Montgomery ordered the British and Canadians to take their objective city. This was Caen, only 10 miles from the sea, but tenaciously defended. The remaining civilians would be warned by leaflets that would be followed by bombs. Under heavy artillery support, the attack went in. On July 9th, what was left of Caen was liberated. Most of her people had fled the city, but the remaining few, though still stunned by the din of war, shook themselves and came out to wave.
As we was going across France, a lot of the French were very cautious about being friendly with us. They were afraid that if we had to fall back and the Germans got any word that they were friendly with us, they'd be in trouble.
Back on the American front, General Collins' forces were engaged in a fierce battle for Saint-Lô. The Allies wanted Saint-Lô for a number of reasons: the prestige value of the effect its capture would have on the Germans, and as an access to the roads leading south.
It's also difficult to move through a city lots of times because of the rubble that usually in difficult fighting, why there's been a tremendous bombardment of artillery, maybe bombs, and you're climbing over piles of bricks and things of that kind. So it's not a pleasant way to fight a war.
The capture of Saint-Lô was a major step in breaking through the heavy layer of German resistance. Like Caen, the captured city lay in ruin.
The results of this July offensive were disappointing. The greatest gain had been only 7 miles. The need was urgent for a way to break out of the containment of the Normandy situation, to get out to flat, dry land so the Army's mobile force could be unleashed.
General Omar Bradley, commander of the American troops, had been forming a plan for some time. Bradley's plan, which was codenamed Cobra, was to gather together an overwhelming concentration of ground troops, twice as great a force as would normally be used on such a narrow front, and combine it with a massive assault from the air by the Army Air Force.
For this attack, heavy strategic bombers will be used in a tactical role or in support of the ground troops. And there's some inherent difficulties with this because those bombers are not built for that purpose. In the first place, the size of bombs and the load of bombs being used by the air forces will create a lot of debris or cratering in the ground, and there's a concern about being able to move ground troops through that area. The second problem is the closeness to the Allied forces. They have to be pulled back to ensure the safety of the Allies from their own bombers. And the concern is that the Germans will be able to reman their defensive positions in the time it will take the Allies to return back to their starting positions.
No plan in war is foolproof, but this one was bold. And if it worked, it would enable the Allies to break the stalemate in which they had become bogged down. Brittany was still the eventual goal.
The first step toward it would be the line between Coutances and Caumont. Between the end of the earlier July offensive and the launching of Cobra, there was a lull of about 1 week. For the weary American troops, it was a welcome respite, a time to relax.
We wondered when is the break going to come? Something's got to happen, and morale was not very good. I think we maybe gained a little, at least our division did, moved ahead on one flank. And we were told that something was going to happen.
On July 20th, a dramatic event electrified the world and revealed that there was no relaxation inside the enemy camp. In Prussia, a planted bomb had demolished Hitler's map room in an attempt to assassinate Hitler, but the plot had failed. Incredibly, the intended victim still lived. Now, as he visited the mangled survivors, his Gestapo was exterminating 5,000 suspects. Hitler himself announced that a group of high-ranking army officers had tried to assassinate him with the bomb in a conspiracy to seize political power. The abortive coup had little effect on the military situation. It revealed no widespread discontent with Nazi rule among the armed forces. The combat soldier was too busy simply trying to remain alive. And the information about the German situation, which the Allies wanted as Cobra neared its jump-off date, was of a considerably more immediate nature. Did the enemy have enough reserves available to counter the attack? Was the Luftwaffe capable of intervening? And finally, would the Germans employ the V-1 or V-2 or some other secret weapon? These were the questions that haunted the Allied camp as it waited to unleash Cobra. July 24th was the day scheduled for the attack. Because the day was heavily overcast, however, with inadequate visibility for air attack, the operation was postponed. Unfortunately, the postponement order reached the English air bases too late to hold back all the planes scheduled for the attack. The bombardment from the planes that did not receive the postponement order was not great enough to damage German positions seriously, and tragically, some of the bombs fell on American positions, killing 25 men and wounding 131. Alerted to the threat of a ground attack, German artillery gave American forward units a hard time for the rest of that day. For General Bradley, an immediate and urgent decision had to be made. The prospects were improving for good weather the next day. Should Cobra be launched even in the face of the possibility that the Americans had now lost the important element of tactical surprise? Or should it be postponed at least for several days, which might then give the Germans a chance to prepare even stronger defenses? Bradley's decision? Cobra would strike again at 11 o'clock the next day. Again, on the morning of July 25th, planes came. One observer called the seemingly endless waves of planes the most imposing aerial parade I've seen since the beginning of this long war. The U.S. troops on the ground were elated as bombs began to tumble from the planes, but gradually the windrows of exploding bombs began easing back toward the Allied line. High in the air and completely detached from those below, bombardiers were aiming at the smoke line on the ground, and a gentle breeze had sent the smoke drifting over the Americans. For the second time in 2 days, Allied bombs had fallen on Americans, this time killing 111 and wounding 490 more. In all, the Air Armada dropped more than 4,000 tons of destruction. But the tactical effect was not immediately clear. Did the bomber attack destroy the efficiency of the German troops? No one could tell. General Collins, 7th Corps commander, who was to spearhead the attack, had little time to ponder the question. For better or for worse, Cobra was launched. Their immediate objectives were the towns of Marigny and Saint-Gilles. Capture of those towns by the infantry would give the Americans control of the roads leading south, and Collins would then be able to catapult his mobile armored forces forward. It seemed reasonable to assume that if the air bombardment had destroyed the German defenses, the infantry troops would be able to reach and secure their objectives without great difficulty. To their surprise, they met strong resistance.
You really don't have the land until you put some footprints on it in war. You can talk about air power and so on, as they do in Iraq today, and what it can do, but you need people on the ground. And I think World War II proved that, because unless you occupy the land, boy, you really don't have it.
At the end of the first day of the attack, Marigny and Saint-Gilles were still in enemy hands. Because the entire success of Cobra depended on a 7th Corps breakthrough, Collins decided to gamble. It would prove to be one of the fateful decisions of the campaign. He pondered the possibilities and the risks and decided to put his armor into action. As the Americans ground their way forward, German defenders found themselves in an increasingly difficult situation. The terrain behind the front favored the attacker, and the Allies had secured a potentially overwhelming superiority on land to complement their superiority in the air. The Allies now had more than 1 million men in Normandy, divided between the 26 divisions of the 1st U.S. and 2nd British armies. While many German commanders supported the withdrawal of troops to the shortest possible defensive line on the Franco-German border, Hitler balked at the idea. Tormented by the disloyalty made evident by the attempt on his life, Hitler grew ever more distrustful of his military commanders. Increasingly, it appeared to him he had to direct the war himself, and he directed the Wehrmacht to stand and fight. Collins' gamble paid off. In mid-afternoon of the 26th, one armored column, having cracked the enemy's defenses around the town, rolled through Saint-Gilles. There was no longer any doubt. The German line had definitely been penetrated. The 7th Corps had achieved its breakthrough. But the drama of the breakthrough did not end at the first defense line. The drama lay in the development of the breakthrough into a breakout of major proportions. The decision to accomplish this was General Bradley's. He had achieved the limited victory he had sought. Cobra had been a success. He could stop now. But he sensed from their disorganized reaction that a deep wound had been inflicted on the Germans. The Americans pressed their attack through rapidly crumbling German defenses. By July 27th, complete breakout from the Normandy beaches had been achieved. The American 4th Armored Division advances 25 miles in 36 hours. The Germans retreat in an attempt to regroup. An interesting aspect of the subsequent campaign is that at the end of July, the front had barely advanced beyond where it had been at the end of June. Yet within another month, most of France was cleared. Such was the totality of German defeats in August. General George Patton appeared on the battle line as the commander of the new U.S. Third Army. A freewheeling, don't-worry-about-the-flank combat leader, he is the ideal choice to exploit the breakout. He sends a strong spearhead force slashing toward the border. Within 3 days, his 15th Corps armored spearheads have wheeled as far east as Le Mans, deep to the rear of the German army.
Initially, the German forces that had been engaged against the Americans at the beachhead in Normandy had reported that U.S. forces lacked aggressiveness. And it's only after the breakout occurs and as the Americans' mobility is being utilized that they discover to their chagrin that American forces are moving very aggressively in an effort to exploit the situation to the fullest.
The Allies drove almost due south through Avranches. The First Army then turned eastward to hit the Germans' flank, but the enemy contested the advance with a counterattack. This German attack was thrown in at the town of Mortain, just east of Avranches, and began in the early hours of August 7th. Had the German tanks and infantry succeeded in breaking through at Mortain, the predicament of all Allied troops beyond that point would have been serious. However, the success of the attack was compromised from the outset. 2 days before the attack began, Ultra, the British decryption service back in England, had alerted Montgomery and Bradley to the movement of panzer divisions westward. Bradley thus had time to realign his forces to ensure that the Mortain counterattack ran into a solid line of resistance just beyond its start line. The main Nazi assault was centered on a 5-mile front between Mortain and Sourdebelle, which was defended by 2 American divisions. Throwing 6 somewhat battered tank divisions into the battle, the Southern columns did achieve some success. The American 30th Division had not been reinforced, and most of its roadblocks were quickly overrun. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, infantrymen from the foremost battalions withdrew to higher ground overlooking Mortain, dug in for an all-round defense, and called down artillery fire on the advancing German army. Progress halted, many German tanks drove off the roads to conceal themselves from the air attack they knew must be coming. The air cooperation of the Allied Air Force against the enemy attack was extraordinarily effective. Medium bombers struck all day at German movement on the roads to the front, while British Typhoon fighters engaged pinpoint targets with rocket salvos. They flew hundreds of sorties, and the Germans could do little to stop them. The sustained assault against the enemy's forces took a terrible toll on the attacking panzer divisions. Successfully withstanding the brunt of the German attack, the Allies now moved to encircle the forward enemy units. This maneuver was to be accomplished by a double thrust, by the Canadian First Army toward Falaise and by the U.S. Third Army toward Argentan. Patton's Third Army split into 2 major groups, one section driving straight eastward from Laval, the other swinging around the enemy flank and driving north into the German position at Argentan. Patton took off with breakneck speed with his divisions. Patton and his divisional commanders were old cavalrymen raised in the tradition of charging on horseback at full gallop, and they transferred this technique to their mechanized divisions. Patton's Third Army moved so fast that they often ran ahead of their fuel supplies. Meanwhile, to the north, the Canadian First Army was preparing to make their advance on Falaise. On August 7th, Montgomery gave his orders. Infantry and tanks would ride south as an armored phalanx. They would ride that night. Promptly at 2300, with artillery firing flares to mark the targets, more than 1,000 heavy bombers dropped tons of bombs to blast a path for the Canadians. At 23:30 came the order to move out, and the ground attack started as 2 armored brigades led by flail tanks moved forward. Behind them came the infantrymen. Searchlight beams bounced off low clouds to bathe the field in artificial moonlight. The weight of the destructive forces from the ground and air, as well as the impetus of the tank infantry pressure, gained the Canadians 3 miles during the hours of darkness. At dawn of August 8th, the troops were through the main line of German defense, but soon found themselves in trouble. They had made deep penetration, and the road to Falaise lay open, but more SS formations were being encountered, and the advance ground to a halt. days after it began, the attack was spent. The Canadians had won 9 miles, but could go no further. The Germans were still astride Route Nationale 158, the bloody road to Falaise. By the night of August 13th, the American 4th Division under the command of Wade Hayslip was on the outskirts of Argentan. Hayslip was certain he could reach Falaise and link up with the Canadians who had stalled on their drive from the north. Together, they could prevent the escape of the 2 German armies in Normandy through the gap that remained between the 2 Allied forces. Bradley sensed the Germans inside the pocket were about to stampede through the Argentan-Falaise gap, and American troops driving toward Falaise might be overrun. In one of the most controversial orders of the war, General Bradley told Hayslip to hold his position. Bradley preferred what he termed a solid shoulder at Argentan to a broken neck at Falaise. Bradley later explained that he wanted to avoid a head-on collision between Americans and Canadians that might lead to a fight between friendly forces, and further felt it was necessary to await Montgomery's invitation to begin closing the gap. But no such invitation was forthcoming. Montgomery was sharply criticized by American commanders for his failure to close the Falaise gap. The arrogant Patton proposed to Bradley, "Let me go on to Falaise and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk." Montgomery's failure to invite Bradley to close the gap may have stemmed from the fact the Canadians were preparing to resume their attack toward Falaise. That assault came on the 14th of August, a hot summer day in Normandy. The Canadian 3rd Infantry and 4th Armored Divisions were to proceed in as narrow a column as possible. As had become the normal practice, the attack was to be preceded by a massive aerial bombardment. The foot soldiers loaded into armored personnel carriers they called Holy Rollers, and just short of noon, they headed toward the sun and Falaise. The leading tanks flail the fields for landmines seated in the ground. The obscuring dust they create and a mix-up in signals confuse the supporting aircraft, and Allied bombs fall among Canadian troops, killing 150 and injuring many others. When the armored columns entered the enormous dust cloud created by the bombers, steering for the sun, which showed as only a disk through the haze, they found the Germans much less resistant. Whenever the Canadians pressed hard, they took the ground they wanted. Many German strong points within the pocket lay within the range of Allied artillery, and all were vulnerable to air attack. Squadrons of RCAF and British Typhoons pounded furiously on the enemy. When night fell, the advance had closed to within 3 miles of Falaise. The Germans were now confined to a horseshoe-shaped pocket 40 miles long with a 25-mile opening to the east, and the gap was narrow. The Canadians entered Falaise on August 16th. The birthplace of William the Conqueror was rubble. That night, without Hitler's permission, Field Marshal von Kluge ordered the first of his troops to begin withdrawing. Several nights would be needed to get all of them out if the sides of the pocket could be kept from closing in and the exit, now only 20 miles wide, could be held open. By August 18th, the gap was only 6 miles deep and 7 miles wide. Pounded unmercifully by air bombings, artillery, and armor, the Germans retreat in stunned disorder. The commanders desperately urge their troops to hold open the mouth of the closing pocket. Their hope is to save their Panzer Division for a stand at the Seine River. Caught in the giant pinchers between Falaise and Argentan, the Germans suffered staggering casualties. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the Argentan-Falaise pocket. The gap finally closed near the little town of Chambois as the Canadian Army, which took Falaise, met the Americans who seized Argentan. More than 50,000 German soldiers were caught within the circle and taken prisoner by the Allies. 8 infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions were captured almost in their entirety. But an estimated 40,000 combat troops managed to escape, among them an army commander, 4 corps commanders, and 12 division commanders, critically needed combat leaders who would fight again. To the Germans, the encirclement of thousands of their crack troops was worsened by the loss of great quantities of invaluable material that they could not immediately replace. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the areas of the war. Roads, highways, and fields were so choked with destroyed equipment and with dead men and animals that passage through the area was extremely difficult. If you had been there that summer, they said, you would always smell death in Normandy. A cloud of decay hung heavy in the hot summer air, and it hung heaviest over the Gap.
With the closing of the Gap, the Allies had completely broken out of the Normandy area and had achieved that long-desired objective, a firm and reinforced Western front from which they could push forward into the German heartland. Now, the race to Paris is on.
On the 15th of August, U.S. and French forces landed in the south of France in Operation Anvil, while U.S. forces drove up the Rhone Valley as part of a double envelopment of German forces west of the Rhine River. The Free French set about capturing vital ports and facilities along the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the British drove across the Seine River and into the area of Pas-de-Calais, while Bradley's 12th Army Group drove toward Paris. It's during this race to the Seine and beyond that the German High Command was discomforted by 2 revelations. First, American divisions were motorized on an unprecedented scale and therefore exceptionally mobile. Second, the U.S. forces displayed an aggressiveness that emphasized their mobility. German infantry divisions, reliant on horse transportation, were outmaneuvered and run into the ground. The result was complete demoralization of the retreating German forces. All of this allowed the Allies to take advantage of a month of relatively unchallenged exploitation as they raced for the Rhine. Following D-Day, the invasion had fallen far behind the pre-invasion schedule, yet as the end of August approached, the Allied Army's advance had far outstripped the expectations of Eisenhower and his staff. Bradley had hoped to avoid a direct attack on Paris, wishing to exploit further east rather than take on the liberation of a metropolitan area. However, as the Allies had advanced, the French resistance rose in revolt. Fearing that the gallant resistance fighters would be defeated, a supporting attack was launched toward the capital. On the 25th of August, Paris was liberated by the Free French 2nd Armored Division and U.S. forces. France was free again, and the Allies celebrated the moment. It was a euphoric time, and some predicted the imminent fall of the Nazi state. The demise of Hitler's Germany would eventually occur, but Germany was far from finished.